Hey friends, welcome to this video. Now here I'd like to give you an introduction on how to use buttons in Power BI and what kind of buttons are available. If you remember, we talked briefly about them in the interface video where I showed you what's available there, but we didn't dive too deep into that, and that's why I thought it makes sense to have another look here. I'm also using, as you can notice here, the Power BI Advanced Training 2 file, because then we already have a dataset set up, and also we have various report pages we can use with our buttons to interact with them. So let's do that. Let me just click on the plus symbol, and you can use the same file if you want to follow along, or you can of course use any other kind of report. So let's click on new page here, and then let's name this page buttons. For instance, let's call this buttons. Of course, feel free to name this whatever you like. The buttons itself can be found under the Insert tab. There is there the option to add buttons next to the text box, shapes and images. And if I click on buttons, there are various options I can choose from. So left arrow, right arrow, reset, and so on. And also here which are new in, I think, in the end of 2021, Power BI introduced that, or Microsoft introduced that, which are the navigator buttons, which is page navigator. We have a look at that. And there's also a bookmark navigator. I won't dive too deep into bookmarks here because bookmarks are extensively covered in my second Power BI course. So if you're interested in that, then you might take a look at that. But in general, what bookmarks do, as a name might already imply, is they can save states in Power BI. Meaning, for instance, you filter your report for certain criteria, and then you want to save this exact state, and you can save them in a bookmark. And then also trigger this bookmark or go to this bookmark using, for instance, the bookmark navigator or, for instance, the bookmark button. That's what they do. Okay, but let's go back to the buttons in general and have a look at what they can do for us. So as an example, I can select here the back button. I can tick this option, and then the button itself is then linked to this specific report page. And I can move the button around the same as I can do for any other kind of visual. The back itself has already an action attached to it. You can also see that if you hover over the specific button. And if I click Control, so my Control key on my keyboard, and click with my left mouse, tick this, then I will go back to my last report page, which is in this case, the final report. But of course, if I, for instance, would go to my top 10 clients first, then I go to the button itself, and then I click on this back button, Control click, in Power BI. So as long as we are in the desktop version, Control click it, and you see that we navigate back to this specific page. So the back button really goes back to the specific page you were previously on. So that's the action attached to it. And if you select the button itself, then of course you can also see the Format Button option here, which is same as for any other kind of visual. But for buttons, of course, there are certain specific features which we would like to talk now. You see that there is an action attached to it. The action is on, and this is why I can Control click here to navigate. If I would turn this action off, then of course this is not longer available. So now I can Control click, but nothing happens because the action is not on anymore. But let's actually maybe start with the general settings. So if you go to General here, then of course you find various properties which probably are also available for various other visualization types in Power BI. So if you select one of them, you can expand it. You can also, remember that, click on the 3 dots here to either expand all categories or collapse all categories. So of course, if I expand all categories, there's a lot to configure here, as you can see. So you can scroll down and take a look at all of these options in here. So for instance, size is the height and the width of the specific button, which you can configure here. Of course, you can also do it manually if you want. You see that those here properties change, but of course if you want to create pixel perfect reports, then it makes sense to specify this here, might be easier. And also you can log the aspect ratio here if you want to keep a certain ratio all the time if you change something here. Position horizontal and vertical, I think this is also clear regarding the report page you're on. You can specify this here, or of course you can drag the button around. It depends on what you want to do. So what else? Interesting, of course, is you can add title. Let me first maybe, let's leave them on. Let's scroll down. I think that's fine. But with the title, for instance, you can turn this on, and then you can add any kind of text title here. So if I specify here a text title and say this is a back button here, press enter, and you see that the back here appears actually as soon as I type it, and it's available here, and I can customize this further regarding the font size, make it bold, and the color and so on. Center it maybe, place it here, and of course make it a little bit bigger, like that. So depends on how I want to specify it here. So what else? Also note that there are these fx symbols, meaning we can conditionally format something. And you see that if you hover over something, it gives you additional information, which is always a good thing if you have not used it before. But in general, it simply allows the same as for other kinds of options for other visuals to do conditional formatting. For instance, you might say, I don't want to see the back all the time. I want to see a specific text. And I can link this to some kind of other option, right, with conditional formatting. Or I can click here and say I want to base this on a field value, for instance, right? So I could do that if I want to do that. And I'm going to show you an example just in a minute, but let's actually explore maybe a few additional things here. Like, as you can see here, text wrap, you want to turn this on or not, of course, depending on the size of your specific title itself. If you want to turn it off, let me turn it off because I think here I don't want to see any kind of title. For the effects as well, I mean, there's a background color. You can turn this on and you can play around with the color. Take it, make it blue, for instance, play around with transparency. Of course, if you set it to 100%, then it doesn't matter what kind of background color you use because it's simply transparent. For the border itself, you can turn this on. Maybe you want to add some border, as you can see here, as we have done for other visuals. Remember, when we went to our final report page, we also used the border here, for instance, and also a shadow effect, which of course is also available for the buttons. Select it, and if you go to the general section, and let me just go in here and say again, I want to expand all categories to see that. If I scroll down, then there is also here for the shadow an option to turn this on and also specify around with the color. Again, there's a conditional formatting because you can also set this to a specific field value. What I mean by that is, for instance, you create a measure, and this measure only contains a hex code, so a color code. And then you can link basically the color of the shadow to this specific hex code. So that means if I turn this on, you can see here now I have this shadow in here. And if I click FX here, color effects, I could say I want to either do it based on here a gradient, a rules, or maybe on a field value. And then I could select any kind of field which I want. So if I go gradient here and I take a look at the colors, let me go to more colors here. And then you see that here, for instance, I can choose any kind of color. Like this one here, for instance. Now I've select something, and this is kind of orange. Or let's go with this one. This is maybe this one here. That's orange. And I can copy actually this value here. So this one here without the hash. Control-C to copy this. And now I can cancel this. And let me just go to my measures table here and right-click, create a new measure. And just to show you this, so there's my measure. Let me just zoom in for the measure. And let's call this is my button color is equal to, and now as within the quotation marks, I can simply paste now this specific, I think I need a hash symbol here as well, the hash, and then the specific color code. And if I do that and press enter, now I have created a field which only stores a color. And of course I could also wrap this in any kind of expression, like for instance, if something happens, then the color should be this, else it should be something else, right? So I could also wrap this and make this more dynamic if I want to do that. But just to show you that, let me just select this one more time. And now I go to the general section and under effects, and let me go to the shadow. And this time I'm choosing the conditional formatting for the color, and I'm choosing a field value. Let's go with field value here. And now I'm searching for color, which is here button color. I select this option and I click OK. And now you see that the background here is this orange, which I have selected. So that's what I meant with the conditional formatting. You can also do this based on a field if you want to do that. So let's explore a little bit more about the button properties, style and action, for instance, because I think those are the most interesting right now. So let me just maybe create a new shape in here, so a new button in here, and let's actually tick, for instance, the back button again. I just leave this the default one for now and just choose another one to show you what's available in the button section here. So again, you can simply click on the three dots and here expand all categories. Sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming because there are so many options to configure, but still, let's maybe stick for that for now. So what can we do here? Well, interesting, as I said, is that each button has different kinds of states. Like for instance, the default state, on hover, on press, and disabled. That means we can, based on the state of the button, change certain properties. And one of them could be, for instance, here, the style. So this is true, by the way, for all the buttons. So I'm just using the back button as an example, but you'll find this appearing for all the other buttons as well. So if I'm using this button here and I go to the style options and say for the default, for instance, I can change the font color, not for the text, it's actually, but for the icon itself. So the line color here, for instance, I could say this, for instance, is blue, and then you see that the color changes, right? So that's totally fine. But what about I only want to have this or specific options with buttons for a certain state? Then I could say the default state should be black, but as soon as someone, if I click here, hovers over the button, then I want to change something. For instance, on the hover, actually I then would like to see maybe here for the line color, I'd like to see a different line color. Then, for instance, I could say I'd like to see this in blue. And also maybe increase the weight, let's say 5. And now, as you see that by default nothing happens, but if I hover with my mouse over the button, you see that now the button changes, right? So that's what I meant when I specified or said that the button has certain kinds of states, and then based on the states, you can change various attributes. For instance, here, the style. So the default is nothing, but on hover, we have seen that that means that, for instance, for the icon itself here, that the line color changes and also the weight of this specific button here changes, right? It becomes bigger. And of course, all the other attributes, like you want to increase transparency, for instance, you can do that. Or for instance, you say on hover, you would like to see a text. So turn on, and then the text, let's say hover, like that. I press enter. And now you also see that if I hover over this, then you see that now there's a text currently in the background of the button, but you see basically what I mean, that you can change any kind of attribute or property for the button based on certain kinds of behavior or interaction from the report consumer. So the same is true for on press and on disabled. So let me go to on hover, and for now, let me actually maybe remove the text. And you also see that, again, there's an FX symbol, which means you can conditionally format that as well, this field. And okay, of course, play around with the font color, the alignment here, vertical, horizontally, the padding, and so on. So let's say we on hover, we had here in this case for the icon itself, we made it blue. And let's say, so for example, if I go in here and say on pressed, this could also be a state. Then I would like to see this, let's say here for the icon, the line color, I would like to see this not in blue, but maybe in, let's say in gray, just to see something different. Or let's use a dark blue. I think this we haven't had that for so far. So you see that if I hover over the button, I'm here. And if I hold Control click here, you see that currently I have still clicked on my mouse. I have not left it because otherwise we would navigate. But you see that now the color is different. And if I now leave my mouse button, then of course we navigate because it has a navigate action attached to it. But that's the general setting for buttons, so you can style them, and this might be sometimes very interesting and an additional report enhancement for your end consumer. So this is for the styling, and as you've seen here, there are various options, again, for the fill, for the border, for the shadow, the glow, and so on. And I encourage you, try those features out, play around with them, and see what fits best your needs. So the final thing is the action itself. The action is quite interesting because this actually means or specifies what actually the button is doing. So you see that if I drag a back button on my, in this case, my report page, then by default, it has the action navigate back to the last page attached to it. Other buttons, or here, for instance, if I go here and click on the left arrow here, see that this button itself has no action attached by default. So I can click here, but nothing happens. But each button has this action attribute. So this means we can turn on the action if it hasn't been turned on by default, like for instance for the back button. And then if you click the action, you see that there are various types of actions which you can select from. So that means that you can actually attach every action to any button. So also, if this is just an arrow and not a back button, but if I like to say here for this arrow button, I would like to trigger an action, I can specify what kind of action it is. And if I would say I want this to be a back button, then I can select it, and then I can use this the same way as the normal back button. So this just means that no button is actually attached to only a certain specific action. You can actually map any action to any button. So if I go back in here and go to the actions here, you see that there are various actions attached. Again, I said that the bookmark as well as the drill through feature are two things which I cover in the second course, so we'll skip this for now. But the other options here are, for instance, page navigation, Q&A, and web URL. So if you know how those work, so the attachment simply, then you also know that the same is true then for bookmark and drill through. You simply attach those features to the button, the action itself. So the back button only navigates back to the last page. The difference here is the page navigation, because page navigation, if I select this one, I could actually specify here itself the destination. So I could say exactly here, okay, where do I want to go? And if I say this button should always go back to, let's say, top 10 clients, then I can select this option, and then it doesn't matter what prior page I selected, because if I now control click here, or as soon as you publish the report, you click simply with the left mouse key, or your report consumer clicks with his or her left mouse key or button, then simply click it and you see that you navigate to this specific page because it's pre-selected in the action of the button itself. So that means something you can set up here for the page navigation. I think that's quite intuitive and easy to use, and that is great. So that's for page navigation. Other options are Q&A and web URL. I mean, web URL is probably quite easy to understand because you can simply enter a URL here, or again, you can simply do conditional formatting and maybe link this to here a specific field, for instance. So if I go in here, I could say a field value, right? Because you can also save a specific URL inside a measure. And again, this could be dynamic, right? Based on maybe a certain selection. But then you simply use the URL in here, and then if someone clicks on it, then he or she goes to the specific URL. So this could be helpful. For instance, if you think about the button, for instance, buttons here, and I go with information or with help. So for instance, if I click on help here, then by default, I get this little question mark icon. And if I drag this around and maybe place it here on top in my report page, then you could say you want to add this. And as a web URL, for instance, you could use an intranet site of your company where there's more information regarding certain specific types or things which you show in the report. This could be, for instance, a use case for that. But of course, I'm just giving you here some proposals. At the end, of course, feel free to figure out how to use it best for your specific needs. A final thing I'd like to mention here is that those formatting pane here is currently, at this point in time, for me, still in preview. That means that it might be the case that certain kinds of properties which you can select here are not working correctly. But this, of course, will be fixed with the next couple of releases. So if you already know about them, then just be aware that maybe there is an issue with a certain kind of formatting here or attribute which is not working correctly, but it will work in the near future. Okay? So the last thing I'd like to show you about buttons in general are, if I click on the down button here, the navigator, and specifically the page navigator option. So if I go to page navigator, select this option, then you see by default, let me just maybe select this button here and also drag this down and also remove this, drag this down, place all of them here somewhere in the middle. And let's have a look at our page navigator, which is this one here. The page navigator actually is an easy way to get all pages inside a kind of navigation pane in here, which means that if you select it, of course I can make this bigger if I want, I would see all my report pages in here. So I can simply control click, for instance, on top 10 clients, control click here, and you see that I will navigate to this page. So it's an easier way, instead of creating manual buttons, so each button for each page of your report, you can simply use under the buttons the navigator and here the page navigator to put all your pages inside here, which you can then choose and select from. And also note that this navigator here, of course, is also customizable. So meaning if you select it first and then you take a look at the options here, you find similar options for the properties, titles, effects, and so on, which you've seen for the other buttons already. And if you go to the visual here, you can play around with other options. For instance, here with the shapes, you see that by default it's rectangle, but sometimes also, for instance, interesting could be the parallelogram. So if I select this one, then you see that now the shapes look a little bit different. So this might also be, of course, depend on your specific, let's say, a naming convention of your specific report pages, because if they are longer, then this might not be the best shape. But I just want to encourage you to try out the different shapes which are available in here, because there are a lot, and you can use those shapes for your navigation in here. You can also play around the corners. If I round the corners, you see that this looks different, the slant and so on, this looks different. So this is really something which means trial and error. There is no perfect setup, but as I said, feel free to try this out and see what you think is best and works best for you. And if you specified something and you don't like it, again, go to the three dots and say revert all settings to default, and you get your default buttons back. Rotation is also available, so you can rotate the buttons like that and other options. I think the most interesting part here is next to the changing of the shapes, of course, that you can specify here whether you would like to have it horizontally as it is by default, or if you go to the grid layout here and say specify here as vertical. If you do this and you change the shape, let's drag it down, then you see that now the navigation is here from the top to the bottom. And this, of course, might look better depending on, again, your specific report design preferences, but I think here this might be a better option to have it here on the left side, for instance, and then use it here for navigation purposes. You can play around with padding here as well, but the main thing here from the grid layout is really the orientation. What's also interesting is if you go to the pages section here, you can specify whether you want to show hidden pages or not. So that means, for instance, DAX or no DAX here is currently hidden. Simply if you right click on a page, you can say, do you want to hide the page or not? So if I do the same for the customer classification here, and I say I want to hide the page, watch what happens in here for, what happens here if we turn off then show hidden pages. So let's say I'd like to also hide this page as well. So now we have two hidden pages, DAX or no DAX, and customer classification. Currently they are turned on. This is why those two pages here are still visible. But if I say I want to turn that off, then you see that now those two pages are gone from the navigation pane. So also something you can customize here under pages. And the same is true for tooltip pages. However, this is something I will cover more extensively in the second course. But you see that it's pretty easy to do. Simply say whether you want to turn them on or off by clicking here, and you see that this navigation then changes. And as I said, there are various properties to change the style. As you can see here, there's also the state option, which you already covered, which means that you don't have to use the menu like that, static, but of course you can also say default here, if someone hovers over, for instance, one of those, what should happen? So if you go for the hover style, click on hover, then for instance, you could say, then I'd like to see a different font color, let's say a blue font, and I also make it maybe bigger. So increase it maybe to, let's say here, something like bold, right? Which means that now if I hover over the pages, you see that now this looks even better, because here now my specific selection here on the hover is highlighted in bold, and in this case also in a different color, which makes it even more appealing to the report end consumer, at least from my point of view. But this is only, as I said, really basic, because there are so many things you can customize, and now I leave this up to you to figure out what's available and what you think is best. And if you have a certain recommendation for me as well, or for other people from the course, then please don't hesitate and write it inside the course resources in the course section, question and answers, okay? So thanks a lot. That's it for the buttons. Hopefully that was helpful. As always, can't wait to see you in the next video. Until then, best guys.